Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Pod and the Pendulum. Usually, we're the show that covers horror movie franchises, and we cover them one movie in one episode at a time. But this week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're preparing for our next deep dive into the Saw franchise and kind of gathering our notes and our resources. But I kind of wanted to do something a little different. I mentioned this when we did our Jaws the Revenge episode, how there were a pair of movies that were out that were sweeping the country and that I really wanted the opportunity to talk about. And then I came across my guest today, her article on her website, Strong Female Antagonist. And I'm like, I need to reach out and we need to speak to one another about this movie. And I was really happy we did so. You know her as one of the co-hosts of the Losers Club, the long-running Stephen King podcast. She's also started, along with our co-host Rachel, Girls on the Boys, a podcast dedicated to breaking down Amazon's The Boys. And also you may remember her as one of the co-hosts of Psychoanalysis, a horror therapy podcast. Let's welcome back to the show for the first time in a while, I think. It's been a bit. Jenn Adams.
It has been a while. Yes. Hello. I'm so happy to be back. And I'm so excited to be talking about these two
why don't we
movies.
talk about the two movies? Why don't you mention them? Because people must be like, oh, the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles right now. And
oh, yeah, of course. Well, and you mentioned the next franchise you're going to cover is...
Oh, boy.
I had to make my
You had to
soft
get that in.
I did. I mean, I wouldn't be true to myself if I wasn't making chainsaw noises.
Well, we may be recruiting you in the future to just make that noise for something that I can't talk about yet, but we'll just have to hire you to just make that noise for the credits.
Special guest Foley noise artist. Yeah.
Jenn, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about Barbenheimer. We're going to talk about Barbie and Oppenheimer. The best double feature I have seen in a long time. So excited.
I will let listeners know, because this is, as people know, it's a podcasting. We're both dressed. We're not reenacting the Florence Pugh and Cillian Murphy scene. So don't get your minds out of the gutter, listeners, okay?
Yeah.
My God.
What's wrong with you, listeners?
How dare you?
This is a family
Is
podcast.
it? Well.
Is it now?
So we're going to keep it loose, and we're going to keep it loose with the discussion. We're not going to cover all the aspects of this movie, because I think, honestly, if we were to cover both films with the level of detail we normally do, it would be a 12-hour show. And as much as I would love to do that, Jenn has a family at home and has to take care of them. So I guess we'll start with we're going to start with Barbie. I think it's the way to start. Let's start on a high note. And I guess before we kind of dive into our kind of discussion points here, what were your initial thoughts on this movie?
I loved it. My first thoughts as I was sitting in the theater, I was like, Greta Gerwig has been reading my diary, because it is a lot of the stuff that I say a lot. It is very patriarchy focused. It is very it's hard to be a woman. Masculinity hurts men too. It's a lot of the stuff that I say and think a lot. And it was just packaged in the most fun movie I think I've seen in a really long time. I laughed out loud. I've never really had a huge crush on Ryan Gosling, but boy, I do now. I thought he was hilarious. It was just so much fun. It was I don't know. The last time I think I watched a movie where I felt like in the very center of the bullseye for the target audience was Assassination Nation. So it had that was kind of the feeling I left with, is I've got to write about this. I've got to talk about this movie. I love it.
What was the theatrical experience like for you? Did you go opening weekend? Was it something you caught at like with press?
I went opening weekend. I went. I hope nobody's listening. I took the day off on Friday, and I went at 8:45 was my show time in the morning. Yes. And I went, and there was a mom and her daughter, and there were two like college age girls in there, and we were just sitting, and we were sitting, and we were sitting, and nothing was happening. And then we heard the credits start, and the screen was still dark. And so we heard one trailer, we heard the next trailer, didn't see anything. We all like went out and tried to find somebody, and nothing happened. So I just walked out and went into the 9:00 IMAX show.
So what you didn't do was pull a Sound of Freedom and say this is a conspiracy that people don't want us to see this movie, because you're a normal person. That is, yes.
Exactly. Yes. Right. Yeah, I did not. So, although now that I'm thinking about it.
What are they trying to hide from us? Yeah, I had a similar experience. I caught like a early matinee of it the day it came out. It was an absolutely packed theater, like to the gills. Really? I did a triple feature. I added Cobweb to the bill. Oh. And I had to drive about 30 minutes out of the way to Foxborough Stadium, Patriot Place, to see all three movies that I was going to see in one place. And I did not know, and I would not have done this, there was like a massive, like I think Luke Combs, like some massive country music concert going on that day. In Foxborough Stadium, there's one road going in and one road going out, and they're not necessarily right off the highway. So it was touch and go as to whether or not I was going to get there. And, you know, Massachusetts is not really a hotbed of the country music scene. So there were some interesting looks that were as you're walking in. So, but the theater was packed, and there was a group of like 12-year-old girls and their mom, and they were super excited, and they started to kind of chatter when the movie started. And usually I'm like, hey, stop talking. But then I thought, I don't want to be the 48-year-old man who's here by himself yelling at a group of 12-year-old girls to keep it down during Barbie, of all movies. That would have been a bad look. So, but I was stunned with how much I really enjoyed it. And I definitely thought of you when I was watching this. I'm like, oh my God, like it's like they opened up Jen's head and just scooped out the thoughts. But I also thought like when I came out, my initial thought was like, I've seen a movie about existential dread and mortality, and it's Barbie. And I was stunned by that. And this idea of like searching for like purpose and identity. And I've already like told clients, I'm like, when this comes out on digital or Blu-ray, like expect this to be part of your homework. Like you're going to be watching this movie and kind of like, we'll be talking about like trying to find an identity or find a purpose. Cause I thought it did an amazing job of that. So kudos to Greta Gerwig and her partner Noah Baumbach for writing this into it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was really like, and I know, you know, I know people have some quibbles with some elements of it, and I admit there are some parts in it that are a little silly. I don't really care too much about that. I can kind of let that go. And I think that the whole Barbie becoming real and Ruth, spoilers.
It's spoiler. Yeah. I mean, at this point, cool. It feels like everybody has seen this movie.
Right. So. Exactly. And I mean, also like, what are we going to do? We're going to spoil Barbie. Yeah. Like she's a doll. But like the whole Ruth Handler thing coming in, there's some logical stuff there that like, if I wanted to pick it apart, I could go really deep down a rabbit hole, but I don't care, because what I love about that ending is another thing that I think is part of feminism or part of patriarchy, and it's feeling human, and it's like feeling allowed to be real. And I think when we have such limited ideas of who we are and who we are supposed to be, we don't feel real. And feeling real, like I actually wrote that in my journal at the beginning of the year as one of my goals, is to become real or to feel real. It's just kind of like accepting humanity and accepting that humanity is going to have pain and it's going to include flaws and it's not going to be perfect, but it is real, and that is better than the facade, you know? And so I loved seeing that element of it too, because I think a lot of girls, well, just a lot of us, I think we grow up thinking about like a very stylized image of who we're supposed to be, and that's not real.
Let's start there maybe, because I think that dovetails nicely into, and I didn't have this in my notes, so I'll try to do it off the cusp, but you also mentioned like the speech during it, the monologue during it, America Ferrera's monologue at one point of like how difficult it can be to be a woman in modern society. And I know Greta Gerwig has said like she's put some form of this in like all of her movies so far. And I remember like Little Women had a part that was similar to this as well. But what about her monologue like really resonated? It's like I hear what you're saying there and all that idea of like being real, the idea that like you have to present yourself a certain way based on whatever role that you've assigned yourself or other people's have assigned you, that like, okay, I have to show this sort of face because of this kind of box I'm in, and that can be really limiting. But what did kind of hearing that monologue mean to you?
Well, two things. One, I think, and you know, I wouldn't be me also if I weren't talking about my own therapy, but I think I have been thinking and talking a lot about who I am in relation to other people and who I pretend to be or who I try to be or how I present myself to other people. And it was in a meeting I was talking about, the topic was things we are good at. And I just started thinking like, I don't like to talk about things I'm good at because I feel like that is sometimes seen as a threat to other people. Like if I'm saying I'm good at this, am I saying you're not as good? Is that the implication? And I think a lot of women and girls, and when I say that, I mean people who identify as girls and women too, we are taught to be who we are in a way that doesn't threaten men, you know? And that is so limiting because yes, we do have more options now, but it's always couched in this, yeah, but don't rock the boat, you know, or don't be too much, you know, don't, like we can be, I'm just going to start quoting everything she said because she's exactly right. It's like we can be angry, but not shrill, or like sad, but not like clingy, you know, it's like there isn't a right way because the right way is not real. And the point is they don't want us to really be human. They still want us to be in this package that they can put below because they can make us subhuman. And when I say they, I mean people who want to support the patriarchy. I don't mean men, and I don't mean any other particular group. I mean,
because we see that with like the movement of like trad wives and trad moms, where it's
exactly. Women feed the patriarchy too.
That there's, and what I always find fascinating with that is like persons that support that get upset when it comes back and blows back on them. Like when they try to express anything outside of that role that they have defined themselves by or that others have defined them by, when it comes back to blow back on them, they're like, well, I meant other people, not necessarily me. Like, why aren't you letting me express the full person that I want to be? And that's kind of what I took from that speech, is this, or that monologue, was what a tightrope that it is, and what an exhausting tightrope that it is, because it feels like it's the kind of thing that you can only maneuver and balance for so long before you fall off, because it's an impossible thing to maneuver forever, because you're never going to get, I hate to say like get everything right, because what we're talking about is expressing who we are as individuals and trying to be our true and authentic selves. And I like what you said there about like, I don't like to talk about my strengths. I don't like to talk about things that I'm good at. And I find like in my practice that that's very common. Like I'm someone that in my practice, I'm like, I'm a strength-based therapist. I'm like, let's tap into something that you're really, really good at and find out how you can manipulate that to in these areas where you're not so good, and trying to get people to talk about what they're really good at, especially women sometimes, is very, very difficult.
Well, I mean, how many times did we talk about that on Psychoanalysis?
A lot.
You know, that me and Laura, we were like, we want some reviews, but just please, and it makes me, you know, and we diminish ourselves. And I think it's something that we are trained to do, not officially, but that is, it's kind of the air we breathe, you know? And
it'll be interesting to look at the opposite of that when we talk about our next movie. When we talk about how this, and you know, we're doing Oppenheimer as well, and we are going to spoil Oppenheimer. Yes, the bomb goes off.
Yes.
Sorry, folks. I had a question, and one of the things that struck me the more I thought about this movie was at the beginning of this movie, when they're in Barbie Land and everybody is singing and having a good time, and Ken's job is beach and all that,
which I love,
which is great. Is Barbie Land as it's presented at the beginning of Barbie, is that another form of patriarchy? Is it just because when I look at it, yes, it's run all by women. Like you have the 9 Supreme Court justices that are all women. There's ladies' night every night. The Kens only exist to be kind of like an accessory for all the Barbies, and unless they are getting attention, they're kind of an afterthought, like they're not even thought of. And that to me just seemed like the patriarchy, but the genders are swapped. That's really all that seemed like to me, because you still had a group of people that had no power and no agency and were completely defined by what the dominant group assigned to them, really. Is that really just another form of patriarchy?
I think so. Let me tell you when I knew that the movie had me and that this was going to be a good movie is when it said Ken only has a good day when Barbie looks at him. I was like, there it is. That's it. I think so. And I mean, I think it would be easy to call that a matriarchy because it is run by women, but it is the same. It's just a gender swapped patriarchy, you know? And one of the things I really love about the movie is that she shows that that's not good either, you know, and that's not what feminists want. Feminists do not want control. I do not want to rule the world. I don't want power. Now, I will say it was very gratifying to see men experience what women have been trying to explain to them for, I don't know, millennia, my entire life. Like that felt really good in the moment to watch. But I think the end of the movie makes a very good point that is a prison too, you know, and it doesn't make Barbie feel better. It doesn't make Ken feel better. Like that's not what solves the problem. But I think a lot of times men can't see it, you know, and so sometimes it takes just flipping it all on its head for it to really for them to say, oh, is that how you feel? Is that what you've been telling us? One thing it is really interesting is when I was talking about like not wanting to talk about things I'm good at, I think I would feel pretty okay talking about things I'm good at in Barbie Land, you know, like the good side of that seems to be like everybody just gets to be what they want. They get to have fun. They get to explore, they get to like celebrate each other. There's no like cattiness except with the men. The men are the ones that are at each other's throats, and it's just so interesting to see it on the other shoe. And because I think that's a lot of times one of my teacher friends says you learn what something is by learning what it's not, you know, and so I think by flipping it really puts it very clearly into perspective. You know?
And I wonder if that is what's made some persons really uncomfortable. Like anything, there's always going to be a backlash, and you have what I have found, like the most insecure people are the ones that, because what they do is like, it's really, they watch that movie and it's holding a mirror up to themselves, and they're seeing all their insecurities. And I don't know who did this, but someone took the poster of Barbie and they printed out a bunch of the 1-star like letterbox reviews of it, like the patriarchy will kill us all. And it's just like, so it looks like an advert for the movie, and it just, all they've done is it always makes the movie look 100 times cooler than it is. It's like, oh, I want to see this even more now.
Exactly. It's like the sign that like witches will teach you about the occult, about psychotherapy, and about all of these great things. I'm like,
that sounds awesome.
Yes, we will. Exactly.
Like,
sign me up.
Yeah, like you're saying, don't threaten me with a good time here, please.
Exactly.
So
right.
My counter to, I think I love movies, but I think that they can be an engine, it can be an empathy engine that with a great art and great movies, it makes me want to delve into other person's experiences even more. It makes me want to look at, I'm like a cisgendered white heterosexual guy. So like not much touches me, I mean? Like I get to kind of blithely go through life some days. Not that I don't struggle at all, but I have it easier than most. And watching this movie and like hearing kind of characters put their own struggles into perspective, it makes me understand more where they're coming from. And then the next question is, well, what can I do to change or alleviate that? Like, how do I become a better person and alleviate that struggle a little bit? Where I think there's a group of people that just don't have any interest in that because they completely lack empathy, or it's because they're in power, because for whatever reason they have a large following that they've amassed somehow by being very spiteful and vitriolic. When you have power, it can be a very difficult thing to let go of. And that doesn't, and not just in like these kind of macro ways, but even in micro ways. Think about times as a parent where if you've ever used the phrase, because I'm your mom, I'm your dad, and that's what I said so. Like how it's like you're exerting power over somebody that way rather than listening. Sometimes you have to do that because your kid will run into the street and you can't have a conversation, but just it can be very hard to let go of power when you have it. How would you counter the argument to somebody that like this movie is like anti-man? Like if someone were to say like, I'm not going to watch that claptrap, like that movie hates men.
Well, I have to say, I read that question in the outline, and the expletives that came into my head, and I feel like I'd tell him to fuck right off. Because
you got Southern right there.
I really sure did. Big bless their hearts. I think some people are never going to hear that message. And I think I have to live with that, and it's not going to be until they want to believe that they are not the victims that they can see that they are not the victims here. But I think one of the things I love about this movie so much, one of the lines that really got me is when Ken is really upset at the end. And he says, once I found out the patriarchy wasn't about horses, I lost interest, which is hilarious. But then he says, it's really hard to be in charge all the time. And I was like, yeah, it really is. And not everybody wants to be in charge. Not everybody wants to run things, and I think men and little boys are raised to think that they have to be in control and that they have to be in charge all the time. And I think just for Ken to kind of release himself of that expectation and to see how much relief he got out of that, I think that is kind of the key for me. And I would say, you don't have to be the most successful. You don't have to be the biggest person. You don't have to be the Will Ferrell in that board meeting. It's okay if you are, I don't know, if you just want to go play with horses or if you want to if your job just wants to be beach, that's fine. Or like, I don't know, I think a lot of little boys grow up thinking I have to be the doctor, not the nurse. Or I can't be an elementary school teacher. I have to be the principal. Or I'm going to be a teacher right now, but I'm getting to be the principal. And I think that is what the gift of this movie for boys and men is showing them that patriarchy is a prison and masculinity is a prison for men too. And, power is not all it's cracked up to be. I don't want to be in charge all the time.
Yeah.
It's fucking tiring.
Yeah, and you see his confidence shat, like when he first learns about the patriarchy, and like I think the scene at the hospital is a telling one. It's like, give me a stethoscope and a clipboard and let me talk to a doctor. And the woman's like, well, I am the doctor, and no, you can't do that. And as he...
Just one little appendectomy, right?
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote this whole movie.
That's okay.
It's brilliant.
As he keeps going from job to job and realizes that, like, he doesn't have any qualifications. He really doesn't have anything that he's excelled at or that he's qualified to do, how he gets like so deflated so quickly. And he just like, and that's when he starts to lash out. And I think that's something that we often see in society, that when you feel like you don't have any options, when you feel like you might have a little bit, but somebody has more than you do, that you want to lash out and you want to take it, or more often than not, you want to take it what someone from underneath you has. Like,
right.
Yeah,
and it's all about like, where does your power come from? Like, is your power coming from within? Are you building power in connection with other people, or are you trying to take power away?
Are you just building a wall but not sideways?
Oh my God. Just like, there are so many little moments where I laughed out loud in this fucking movie, and that was one of them. But yeah, and I think what Ken sees is he can't just demand power. You do have to build it. And I think what a lot of the patriarchy is about stealing tiny amounts of power from other people and just building on that. And when Ken realizes he has not been amassing all of this power all this time, and being a man gets him very, very far, but it doesn't get him all the way there. That's when he starts trying to take the power from Barbie. Yeah. And I think what Barbie says is like, we can find the power within ourselves to be who we want to be. And if we can accept who each other actually wants to be and the version of ourselves that makes us happy, there's power in that. And then when there are two of us that are feeling powerful together, like, that grows and it grows and it grows, and that's what we want. And that's what I would call a matriarchy.
Yeah, I would say like what you see at the end of this movie is definitely that when you don't, I think it was really important that the movie doesn't just go back to the status quo that was there at the beginning of the movie, because then there's no progress that's been made, and you still have this unequal sharing of power and this unequal kind of sharing of, I don't even know what it would really call it, but just this responsibility. I don't know if responsibility is even the right word there, because at the beginning of the movies, the Kens kind of have it pretty sweet. Like, they don't really have to do anything at all. Like, they've been absolved of all sort of like obligation or responsibility except being eye candy. And at the end of this movie, you have something where it is like a lot more equitable towards, except for Alan. There's always going to be, I wasn't ready for Michael Cera action star.
I know. I was very impressed with Michael Cera. I think the last time I actually saw him in something was just being super shitty, and This Is the End.
Okay. It's been a bit.
Yeah, it has been a while. And I love Arrested Development, but I hadn't seen him in anything in a while. But Alan was interesting. And I think it's interesting to see him surround himself with women. I had a paragraph about Alan, and I ended up taking it out because I couldn't quite get the thought. I thought it took away from what I was saying about Ken. And I just couldn't quite get my mind wrapped around how I felt about Alan. Because there is only one Alan, and in reality, there's only one Ken, and there's only one Alan, and there's only one Bill, and there's only, like, we're not all different versions of one person. You know?
Ken wasn't a hive mind. Like, it wasn't like all the Kens.
Exactly.
It wasn't like every Ken and like just like Barbie was in a hive mind, like they had different Barbies, had different personality traits, had different strengths, had different interests, and even though they worked together and celebrated one another collectively, it wasn't like they all had collectively the same interests or talents. And I thought that was a important distinction. And I guess one of the things I was thinking of was like how this movie, because to me it's really surprising how much Greta Gerwig got away with, like how much Mattel was able to kind of give the green light to, because this is a movie that makes merciless fun at consumerism and capitalism and this idea of like mass consumption. Like it reminds the audience, and the primary audience for this movie is allegedly like young preteen girls that would play with this doll, right? That, oh yeah, the person who created it is a tax cheat who kind of ran. They don't mind telling you that over and over again. And that, like, yes, there are things like weird Barbies when you play with them too hard, which I thought was great.
I do too. I cut my Barbie's hair and I could never get it back in that ponytail.
Nope.
Yeah.
What do you make of like the kind of contrast of like symbology of Barbie, where in one hand she was created to kind of be this icon that would allow young girls to dream big, to see themselves as doctors or policewomen or judges or politicians. This idea that when it was created, the idea was like, as a young woman, your life can be limitless. It can be whatever you want it to be. Imagine it and make it happen. Contrasting that with the other symbol that Barbie is, or the negative side, that she's this creates this unrealistic standard of femininity where there's like, if she were proportioned like this in real life, she would not be able to walk straight. And to the degree that they even make it a point, like when Barbie is talking about feeling ugly and growing older and not being as attractive, you have Helen Mirren, who herself is an ageless beauty, say, by the way, if you want to make this point, casting Margot Robbie, not the right way to go here, everybody. Because Margot Robbie is the closest thing, one of the closest things we have to like an A-list movie star under the age of like 35 right now. Like, she's exquisite. What do we make of these contrasting symbols?
Well, I think America Ferrera in the movie says kind of what comes to mind is we can't expect one symbol to solve it all for us, you know? And I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes into my mind too. Like, we cannot put the salvation of humanity or the saving of feminism on one figure or one person. Like, it has to be a combination, because while Barbie did do a lot of great things, and it did allow girls to see themselves doing things and to see themselves as being something besides a mom and a housewife, you know, and while that's a perfectly wonderful thing to be, there are other things too. And that is great. That is fantastic. And that has changed lives. But she's also done a lot of harm. And both of those things can be true at the same time. Like, I know that there are probably women and girls whose lives are worse because of the image that Barbie has become and this standard. And because she is a plastic doll that never changes, there is no season of her life where she looks like that in college because she doesn't have kids and she's able to work out every day, and she's maybe doesn't have a healthy diet, and then she has kids and her body changes. Like, Barbie's body is never going to change. And I think we can't let a piece of plastic be a symbol for humanity. I think it can get us a long way down the road, but it can't do everything for us. Like, we have to take the next step. And I think they have. Like, I'm not up on all of the different versions of Barbie, but I know that the body shapes have started to fluctuate a little bit. And I think that there is an awareness of how negative that ideal of feminine beauty can be, and that becomes the ideal. And I know, you know, but I just think, I don't know, we have to be able to like we can't just have a astronaut Barbie and think we solved feminism, you know, because it's bigger than that.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, because really what it is like we have an astronaut Barbie, and now our Q4 earnings are up by 3% because this one sold through the roof. And I think I walked out of the theater going, someone from Hasbro wrote this movie, because it takes so many shots at Mattel and the way, like, Will Ferrell was kind of riffing on what he was in the Lego movie. Like, this is him a little bit more grown up and a little bit more in a position of power. And it was kind of like if Buddy the Elf went corporate, is the way I would look at it, is because there were things he would say that I would think are hilarious. Like, I just want to tickle somebody sometimes. And I was trying to explain to my daughter, like, there was a point where, like, this guy was like the biggest movie star we had in the world for a period of 5 or 6 years. And like, when you come home, like, we're going to watch Step Brothers together. It's time.
I think my brother might still think he's the biggest movie star in the world.
It'll be interesting to see how Strays does. I'm very interested in a foul-mouthed talking dog movie. Like, that seems like it's right up my alley. But yeah, that's kind of gone out of style to a certain degree. And now you see him, and he's always great when he pops up. Like, whenever Will Ferrell pops up, I'm like, that's not a bad thing to me, but it's not necessarily the same thing anymore. And you can tell that casting him in that role is meant to skewer that type of corporate executive. And even some of the things they would say is like, oh no, we're still pretty rotten to the core. We just do a much better job of hiding it now. Like, we're much better at, which is very true. How important do you think, like, this is a movie that is packed with ideas, and we'll talk about one more before we move on to our next movie here in the double feature, but how important is it to package some of these ideas in what is ostensibly a children's movie? Like, one of the things I heard walking out of this movie was, like, parents say to some of the younger kids, like, well, you probably don't understand a lot of it right now, but as you get older, it will make more sense. Despite having these really big ideas, it's packaged with some great songs. It is a gorgeous movie to look at. It's just like popping with color everywhere, filled with absolutely beautiful people from start to finish, and has some of the most unique practical set design that you're going to see. How important is it to package these ideas in a movie that is this colorful and bright and funny and lively? It's almost like a Trojan horse.
Exactly. Yeah. This is how we get you. Well, and I think about one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Dirty Dancing. And I watched that when I was in like first, second grade. And there was an abortion storyline in that movie, and it went totally over my head. I was like, Patrick Swayze is hot. I love these songs. I want to be in the big number at the end. And then I grew up, and I started to think about that. But I already loved Penny in that movie. And so I was immediately more empathetic to that storyline. And once I started to really figure out what it was about, I had a context that I could pull from it with something that made me feel really good and made me feel happy, and was something that I was allowed to watch, that I didn't get in trouble for, that wasn't off limits. And I think it's kind of the same with Barbie. The other thing that I was going to say when I said there were two things, and I forgot to say the second, was I love that the way they turn the Barbies out of the patriarchal mindset that they're in is by saying these things out loud. And they speak these words to someone else, and that makes a little bit of a difference. And I think, I want my daughter to watch this movie and to live in a world where kids are seeing people say these things out loud and not get made fun of or not get laughed at or not get in trouble or not feel like we're wrong or that the men are going to get mad at us, And I think that even if they don't understand everything, because a lot of girls aren't going to understand how hard it is to be a woman until they actually are one, or how hard it is to be a grown up. But they have heard America Ferrera say these things, and maybe they'll say it and they'll just kind of be kidding with their friends. But then one day it's going to click, and they're going to understand it in a framework that felt like it was made for them and that made it safe for them to say those kind of things. And I think that's a big stepping stone, you know, because I say a lot of this shit and, you know, I get comments on Twitter or I get like, why do you hate men? And I think, you know, I want little girls and little boys to see this movie and understand that it's okay to say these things and it's okay to think these things, you know.
One of the best reactions I witnessed, like after the movie ended, I went into the bathroom and 4 dudes walked in and they were like late teens, early 20s. Like you would identify them as bros, like not the kind of, and one of them.
Not Hasbros.
Yeah, Hasbros. Womp womp. Excellent.
I'm going to coin that. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt.
Excellent. One of them was like, Barbie was pretty mid. And I didn't say it was bad. It was just pretty mid, which I guess is kind of like, it's okay, I guess, as the kids would say. I'm still figuring this out. And his 3 friends like turned to him and they're like, what are you talking about? That was awesome. Like, that was so good. And they were like, and then one is like, I'm going to dunk your head in the toilet if you say that again, which was okay. So, and then it's like, now we're going to see Oppenheimer, which was great.
That's awesome.
And it was surprising to see is like kind of guys you would not typically think are going to have that sort of reaction to it because you're able to kind of put these ideas in something. It doesn't feel like you're being scolded. It doesn't feel like you're being talked down to. And I think like you had said, like sometimes I'll put these ideas out there on Twitter and like I'll get scolded for it or it feels like, well, why do you hate men? Which I obviously know you don't do. I think the opposite can be true sometimes is that we live in a time where we're demanding like moral purity from people and ethical purity from people where if you deviate from an idea at all, if you deviate from this, if you're like, well, I have a little bit of a different take on it, although I agree with most of what you're saying, here's where we diverge. It's like, well, you obviously aren't an ally. You don't agree with me at all. What is wrong with you? Like you're, hate to say canceled, because I don't think cancel culture is a thing. I think that there's the consequences of your actions, but I can't think of a better way to put it right now. Like you're cast aside essentially for not. And I think that's where a lot of progressive ideas get tossed out of the center because it feels like, well, if I don't 100% agree with you, I guess I don't agree with anything you're saying at that point, which kind of sucks. I found that like we also can expect more of kids than we do. I think that
absolutely
kids will surprise you with how much they're able to take in and how much they're able to understand. And I think one of the real joys of being a parent is when you see your kids start to wrestle with some of these really big ideas and you're able, that's kind of like one of the more enjoyable parts of parenting is like talking about it with them and getting these ideas with them. The last thing I had about Barbie was, and I really like this in your piece, you talk about how at the end of the day, neither Ken nor Barbie do and should define themselves by their relationship to each other, that it's about finding yourself as an individual and not necessarily like we all play roles. Like I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a counselor, I'm a son and a brother. But though I'm not just those things, and what they mean to me might be different from how another person is going to interpret it. How do you think this movie did with kind of balancing the real need that we do have for companionship and friendship without saying, well, you define yourself by your relationship with another person?
Well, you know, I'm not going to lie. I was watching the movie and I was like, when Barbie apologizes and she says it didn't always have to be girls' night, there was a part of me that was like, yeah, Barbie, if you had just shown him that you love him more. You know, that was my reaction. And I think that's because of what I've grown up in. You know, I mean, Southern trad wife culture is huge down here. And I think I really had to stop myself and think, no, she doesn't owe him anything, you know, and I love that they don't end up together and that she is allowed to say, I don't love him. She doesn't have to give a reason. And that doesn't mean anything bad about Ken. It's just that they are not in love with each other. Or Ken, and I mean, I don't know if Ken actually stopped to think about it. I don't know if he's in love with Barbie. He's just been taught that that's what gives him meaning, is this relationship. And I think that that is what we raise our kids to believe, is that, you know, like we buy our babies these onesies that say like future heartbreaker, or like, you know, and we're already conditioning them to be in these heteronormative relationships where there are very clearly defined roles. And not that there's anything wrong with those roles. The problem is when kids grow up to believe that that's the only thing that's going to make them happy, that the only thing that's going to make them a man is finding a hot wife and having kids or spreading their seed and dominate, you know, and it's just so limiting. And I think, you know, maybe Ken and Barbie would get together down the road once Ken has a little bit more of an understanding of who he is. But I love that the movie kind of releases that pressure on them, because they've always, like, he was made to be a partner for her. And I think a lot of girls grow up trying to figure out the best way to be a girlfriend that men will want. And men do that too. We just don't say it so bluntly, you know, and that there's a lot of pressure there, you know. And I think when you can release yourself from that pressure and figure out who you actually are, then lots of times you'll find somebody who like likes the you that you like, you know.
Yeah. And the one thing you said, like, well, she doesn't really owe him anything, and I agree with most of that. She certainly doesn't owe it to Ken to like be his girlfriend. Like, she doesn't owe him that at all. I would say the only thing that she owes him would be like being honest with him and saying like, it does feel like, and maybe she doesn't realize she's doing this, but she's stringing him along. And I think that's really important at the end, where she says, well, I don't love you. And that allows Ken to be free to figure out, okay, well, I'm someone that is like worthy of love. And if this person doesn't love me, then I need to find someone that will, for who I am.
Right.
And also I would say that like not every night does need to be girls' night. And what I mean by that, in a friendship, if you're a friend, you take into consideration, well, what does the other person want? That you're not really a friend with somebody if they get to pick the activity every time. You're not a friend to somebody if you come home and you vent for hours but don't ever ask how is their day going. Like, that's not being a friend. It's a friend is sometimes considering, hey, how are my actions affecting this other person, and how are they doing it? Am I checking in on them? At the same time, you don't owe it to anybody because you don't owe anybody your friendship. Like, you have the right to say, nope, like, I actually don't want to spend time with you. And that's okay as well, as long as you can, you know, do it in a way that doesn't rip somebody to shreds. So.
Right. And I think that the Barbie land that we see at the end, where, you know, I just want to believe that it's a utopia where everybody kind of just feels this freedom to like be weird or to be what they want to be, that it's a lot easier to hear that kind of thing, you know, like, no, I don't think you're the right friend for me. And if you already feel like, okay, well, I'm going to go, I've got my horses, I'm going to be okay because I've got my horses, and I know that that's something that I really care about, it makes it a lot easier to hear, I don't want to be your friend, and tonight is girls' night, and it's always going to be girls' night, and I'm sorry, you know. But when you don't have anything in your entire existence is based on being friends, being Alan, being friends with Ken, you know, then when you hear that, no, you feel like you don't have anything, which is where we see Ken at the beginning, you know. And I mean, his sweater, it's not even a sweater, it's like a college weed hoodie is what I think I would call it. It says, I am Ken-uff. Like, it's so dumb, but I love it. Like, that's the point, is we want to, and I mean, this is still something I'm trying to figure out how to do, is to figure out or realize that like you're enough on your own as you are. And that doesn't mean you're perfect. That's what I love about her not having an ending. Like, this is not the end of her story, because the end of everybody's story is just death, you know, and the next day might be something completely different. But
would have been,
you can figure out,
very harsh if the movie ended like 50 years in the future and Margot Robbie in like old age makeup and she just dies. That would have been
kid. She falls over on the AstroTurf, but it's not just out of sadness. It's that she died, you know? Yeah. Oh, it's such a good movie.
Well, let's talk about our other movie. Any last thoughts on Barbie, though, before we move on? I think we could do more like a scene by scene, but we're not going to do that today. Again, we'll be here all.
I mean, a billion years or a billion thoughts about it. I think the last thing I want to say is I have said I want my daughter to watch this movie, but I also want my son to watch it, you know, and I want him to live in a world where girls can be anything they want, but boys can be anything they want to. And that's what the goal of feminism is, you know? Yeah.
You had said how Ken saying like, it's really hard to be in charge all the time. And sometimes I don't want to be. I've had this conversation similar with many men who feel disconnected from others and feel disconnected. And there is a real problem that as men get older, it does become harder to make friends and to make connections with other men because other, you know, outside of work and family, it can become much harder to form those bonds with other guys. Like that's been a real thing that's been studied and talked about, and not to say like, oh, boo-hoo men.
Yeah.
But I've had this conversation with a lot of men about how they feel like they can't express when something scares them, whether it's like a financial situation or a family situation or just something on an existential level that frightens them because they feel like it's their role and their responsibility to always be strong and never be vulnerable. And the problem with that is they wind up alienating themselves from the persons that they mean to protect because really we can't be authentic and we can't be honest with the people we care about the most if we always feel we have to put up a facade and we have to put up some sort of mask that hides how we really feel in any given situation.
Yep, and that's how the patriarchy hurts men too, you know. And I used to say on Psychoanalysis all the time, like, I wonder how different my life would be if a key couple of men had gone to therapy at some point in their life, you know. And I'll say, like, Corey and I, before we moved, we lived in a really isolated community, and we just didn't really interact with friends that much. And since we moved out here, we've met a lot more. He's met a lot more friends his own age who have kids his own age, and we as a couple are a lot better off because of that too, not to mention that he's just happier. And so but it can be really hard, you know?
Yeah. Just like I had this conversation with someone, like, how do I meet people? Like, that's what they ask. Like, how do we just go out? Because it does feel like, I mean, I feel like I know a lot of people. I'm pretty social by nature. But I also know that, like, I mean, we were talking off air. Like, I was just out at a film fest, and there were a lot of people there that, you know, I know from online that were out there. And I would approach them and, like, introduce myself and start talking to them. But I felt like this disconnect. It was almost like, wait a minute, we're not supposed to interact in this setting. Yeah. And it kind of brought back that, like, being in high school and not knowing what table to sit at type of feeling. And I'm like, man, I'm too old to worry about this shit. Yeah. You know? All right, let's move on. Let's talk about our second movie, which is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. And I got to ask, I know a lot of people dressed up for Barbie. They were wearing pink. They were in outfits. I was heartened to see so many young girls dressed up in pork pie hats with candy cigarettes coming out of their mouth. Really thought that's
what I wore.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. What were your initial thoughts coming out of Oppenheimer?
I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I'm a Christopher Nolan fan for the most part. And I love Cillian Murphy, like old school crush for me ever since 28 Days Later. So I was going to really like this movie, and I really like historical biopics, you know, or biopics, if that's what we would call this. I like this kind of movie. I like this time period of history. I like everybody in the movie. Oh, fucking Josh Hartnett is in this movie and so hot. And I didn't know he was going to be in this movie. So that was such a pleasant surprise. And I was like, is that fucking Josh Hartnett? Oh my God. And then I just swooned and my heart grew 3 sizes. It took me a little bit of time to adjust to the pace and the black and white and the going back and forth. And I had to kind of just sit with it and let it kind of sink in. But I loved it. And I think it looked great, sounded great, felt great. Performances were fantastic. And I think I didn't go into it with any kind of expectations except that Cillian Murphy was going to be hot. And so I loved it. Yeah. What about you?
This is my favorite movie of the year so far.
Really?
I've gone in for a second round. I'll probably go for a third. It has sent me down like a historical rabbit hole because this is a period in history that I find like very fascinating myself. And I have found like I went out and just immediately bought like American Prometheus and devoured that in about a week. And then
because that's what this is based on, right?
It's based on
essentially.
Yes. And the authors of that have said like it's as faithful a script to what they could imagine. Like they think it's one of the most faithful adaptations they could have seen. And it is. Like if you read the book, the only difference I would say between the book and the movie is like some of the things in the movie don't happen. Like that scene between Oppenheimer and Einstein at the pond at the Institute doesn't happen. But they have other interactions. Like they were contemporaries and a couple characters I think are so they take liberties in that way, but for the most part, it's very faithful, except the book is very linear. And what you said here is like one of the fascinating things about this movie is the way that it's structured and that it bounces along all of these different timelines and unfurls in that way. And you're not quite sure what's the end game here, because the end game of the movie, like you think it would end with like the bomb going off and then you're like, all right, everybody go home. But no, like have the Trinity test, and then there's an hour left in the movie that is this procedural, and it becomes almost a different movie in the way that it's structured and the tone and what you're getting out of it. And what I couldn't help but think of is at the beginning of this movie, you see Cillian Murphy lying in bed, and he can tell that he's troubled and you see what's going on in his brain, and it's these ripples. It's these droplets that come down and then just expand outward. And as this movie goes on, you see these small events that occur that have massive ripples and repercussions later on. Like a conversation, really what brought Oppenheimer down is a conversation he had in a kitchen with a friend that he didn't really think much of until he lied about it later on. And that was like the key piece of evidence that brought J. Robert Oppenheimer down and had his security clearance removed by the AEC. And it was just a conversation in a kitchen between two friends.
Yeah. Now, and obviously know a lot more about this than I do, but do you think that if it had not been that, if he had not lied about that conversation, it would have been something else?
So I think one of the things you see in this, I love getting this version of Robert Downey Jr. back.
Me too,
it's his Oscar to lose at this point, I would say. He's kind of channeling like evil Tony Stark. And I hate to reduce him to that, because like before he played Iron Man, he was like such a tremendous actor. And it's just nice to see him in a role like this again. The animosity between Strauss and Oppenheimer is very real. And one of the things that you've learned about Oppenheimer is he had, and it's why he was so good at running Los Alamos, he had this ability to be very gracious to people that were underneath him. That if he could recognize your talent as a physicist or as a chemist or a mathematician, and he could be he's like, well, you're very good, but not quite as good as I am. And he could be very gracious to those people. but persons that he didn't feel were like that were either that felt were kind of like really beneath them, he could be very contemptuous towards. And the film shows these events. It shows the congressional hearing where Oppenheimer kind of rips Strauss's argument to shreds about like sending out the isotopes. And then when he snubs his children, when he snubs, like, I want to introduce you to my son and his future wife, and he just kind of like waves them off. Like, all of these things made Strauss want to bring him down. And the book lays out the case very, very clearly. But it doesn't spend a lot of time on Strauss's comeuppance. It just spends maybe one page saying, eventually, in a congressional hearing, all of this came out and it ruined his political career. Where it's the whole last act of the movie here is all of that intrigue. So it's really fascinating to watch that play out.
Yeah, and I had no idea about any of that. I didn't know very much about
it's
any of
very
this
accurate.
Into it.
It's
Is it
very
really?
accurate.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
This is like
I'm going to put in
this is like when I talk about Chernobyl, because I fucking love that.
I still need to watch that.
Oh my god, it's so good.
I'll put in the show notes. I'll put like a little bibliography in because of all the stuff that I've like watching and reading these past few weeks, kind of diving into
like
it.
An essay, a book report. Yeah.
We talked before about this idea of like not being good at something and not wanting to talk about it, and this idea that like I kind of want to hide my talents in some way, or I don't want to acknowledge what I'm good at because it feels like I'm being like a braggart at that point, and nobody wants to hear a braggart. This is the opposite of that. Like, what you're seeing here is this massive amount of hubris on the part of Oppenheimer and these other scientists, in that once they figure out like, oh, we can split the atom, like we can bombard these electrons and get, or these nuclei, and get them to split and then cause this reaction, they immediately think like, oh, we can make a bomb out of this. They show a little bit of it, but it seems like once that train gets rolling, there's no stopping it, right?
Yeah. And that's when I started thinking about pairing these two movies, because this movie, to me, Oppenheimer, feels like such an exploration of masculinity. What is masculinity? It's the quest to be the biggest, the strongest, the boldest. And that is what this movie is about. And once they say, yeah, we can do this, we can make a bomb, there's no deviating from that, even when he knows he probably shouldn't, or that there are other things he should be considering. And I don't know if I'm going to say they should not have created the bomb, because I do agree somebody was going to, but that's a patriarchal culture that we have all been born into, is this idea that if I don't do it, somebody else is going to beat me to it, and I've got to be first, and I think it's such a male movie, and it's such a, like, this is a world where I think men feel very comfortable talking about what they're good at and being okay with that, because I think that is part of male culture, is that you've got to, you fake it until you make it. And that's what I think they were doing with this project in a lot of ways too, is like, just, we've got to get there first. And I think when that is the only thing you're focused on, you lose sight of like the snake under the rock, I loved that metaphor,
The defense I can see in it is when they say like the Nazis are definitely working on this project and they have some of the greatest scientific minds in the world working on this right now. We have to get there before they do. Because I don't doubt for a second that if like Hitler developed the atomic bomb before America did, that they would have used it. I don't think for a second they would have hesitated to bomb like Great Britain back into the Stone Age with every atomic bomb they could find. I don't doubt that for even a second. And I don't doubt that he would have bombed like Russia back to the Stone Age if they could have developed it. What's fascinating here is once they realize that like Germany is like on the wrong track, and then by the time the bomb is developed, by the time they know, like, okay, we are actually going to be able to make this thing, Germany is all but surrendered. Like, they just know that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, that they still continue to make it. And Oppenheimer's argument is, we're just the scientists. Like, this is really no different from making like other rockets or missiles. Like, it just is a much bigger version of it. And I think the idea of like Prometheus comes in here, that stealing fire from the gods and then being punished for it, is like he became, and I think Nolan does an admirable job of depicting this quality of him. When you're when you travel in theory, this idea of like, well, something is possible, let's travel down this road, I think you often leave the practical concerns out. You don't take the time to think, well, what would this actually mean if we can create it? And I think the hubris here is like, well, I'll leave that to someone else to figure out. I just want to be able to make it. How much do you think the film where do you think that Nolan and Oppenheimer comes down on Oppenheimer the man? Do you think that it's a celebration of him? Do you think that it's an apologist? That the movie comes down as a sort of apology for him? Or do you think there's some condemnation there?
I think yes, and yes. I think all. And I think that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed the movie as much as I did. And kind of what we were saying about Barbie is that, like, it doesn't have to be only one thing. And yes, Oppenheimer, he had a lot of great qualities. He did a lot of incredible things. He did change the world. And, you know, what's the argument? Like, dropping the bomb allowed us to bring troops home. Like, there are people whose lives he probably saved. But the opposite can also be true. And I think that Nolan does a really great job of showing how conflicted this character can be, and that all of those things can be true, and that you can celebrate someone and also show that they are responsible for thousands of deaths, you know, and that we don't just have to say one thing about somebody, and we don't have to be one thing. And just because history will remember him as one thing doesn't mean we have to keep saying that, you know?
Yeah, I saw these arguments when the movie came out that it shouldn't even be considered. It should not have been made, or that the movie doesn't show the victims of the bomb, that it doesn't spend any time in Japan, or it doesn't show some of the ranchers that lived out near Los Alamos that were like basically had eminent domain, like the government used eminent domain to take over their land and create this research facility, that those stories weren't even considered. And I hate arguments like that, because I don't like to talk about like what a movie isn't, or what the story. And to be honest, it wasn't the point of the movie. And I also feel like there are arguments that are made in bad faith, that if Nolan had shown the bomb being dropped over Japan and you were to depict the very real victims, that the argument would then from the certain persons would become, well, now you're glorifying the victims here, or now you're just, it's misery porn. It's like showing you're kind of making a spectacle of it, and you're profiteering off real human suffering and real human loss. We talked about this with Barbie a little bit, but good art makes me want to learn more. So when someone says, well, I've been trying to make this movie about the ranchers that were displaced and they can't get made, my first instinct to say is, well, you're not Christopher Nolan. You're not on the same level, but I also want to see you make that movie. I would watch that movie. I would read that book.
Same. Yeah.
If I want to see the suffering of the Japanese and how they came out of it, then I will watch Black Rain. I will watch Hiroshima. I will watch those Japanese movies that show them wrestling with the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I want to watch it and hear it from their perspective. Hell, I'll watch Gojira, which I think is one of the, it's a movie about a giant lizard creature that breathes fire and destroys Tokyo, but it's one of the most, it's such a moving portrayal of a country that's like wrestling with the aftermath of atomic war. And it's terrifying at times in terms of how it shows the victims from that movie. So it'll make me want to go out and seek out those things. Mm-hmm. I think that the movie, paints a much more complicated picture of Oppenheimer than the book American Prometheus does, which I feel celebrates him a lot more. And I think, honestly, brushes aside a lot of and kind of waves aside a lot of critique of him. The scene, one of the most terrifying and anxiety-inducing scenes of any movie I've seen this year, is after the bomb is dropped. I think what's fascinating is, one, when he gets the call, the first sound that you hear is like a baby crying off in the distance. It's the first thing you hear. Is just a baby wailing. And that, to me, is fascinating, that is the first sound you hear when Oppenheimer gets the call from Groves, like, oh, we've been successful. But when you have the scene later on in the gymnasium, when everybody is stomping their feet, and it sounds like a locomotive. Like, I remember watching the trailer and thinking like that was the sound of a locomotive. And that, to me, is a sound of something with forward momentum being inevitable. That once we put these events into motion, nothing you could have done, even though there were a lot of points along the way where we could have made a different decision. Maybe we drop the bomb over an island. Maybe we just share this information with our allies and cooperate with one another, how much different the world would have turned out. But it feels like that was never actually going to happen.
Yeah, and I think we are just too staunchly built on a patriarchal world for that to really be a realistic option now. One thing I loved about that scene, because I agree with you, it was terrifying, was I think it really shows kind of, again, what we were talking about Barbie, is the dichotomy of how he is actually feeling about this and how he's supposed to feel about it, because he's giving this speech and I think he's like celebrating and he's thanking everyone and they're cheering and he's like, I wish we had it for the Nazis or something like that. And that's what he's supposed to do. That's victory. That is success. They've just become the biggest and the strongest. But what he's actually feeling is that this crushing weight of fear and that like this is real to him now. And I think he was just alive at a time where men were not really allowed to talk about that too much. And we even see Groves kind of shush him in a meeting. And I know it's a little bit different. There's more complicated things going on in that meeting. But one thing I think that is really interesting about the second half of this is showing a man from the 50s around this point really wrestling with this guilt and these really heavy emotions and trying to tell people, and then getting Truman calling him a crybaby,
Which again happened, which is a real right. And I think they condense it into one scene. I don't think that it all happened in that necessarily that order, but to a certain degree, I can understand Truman's point of view, because he's not wrong when he says, they're not going to remember you as the person who dropped the bomb. They're going to remember me for that. That the blood is really on Truman's hands. At the end of the day, they don't remember the person that necessarily created it. They just remember the person who made the decision to do it. And one of the things that's fascinating, I'm reading this book, it's called 5 Days in August, and it's about dropping the bomb in Hiroshima and then Japan surrendering 5 days later. And one of the things the book talks about, and it wrestles with, it really like lays bare the myth that Japan was never going to surrender. Like, it actually shows a timeline, like Japan was preparing to surrender we were just negotiating the terms, whether it would be conditional versus unconditional. The idea that like Hirohito, the emperor, like Japan wanted him to remain a figure in the Japanese political system, and we didn't want that. And we actually, he did remain in power. Or not in power, he did remain as a figurehead, just a powerless one. This idea that the military they didn't focus on the word atomic and atomic bomb, they focused on the idea of the word bomb. And all the atomic bomb was to them is a more efficient way to firebomb. Because we were already firebombing Tokyo, and we had killed 100,000 civilians in one night, like a mere week before dropping the bomb. The difference is the scale. Now you can do that with one bomb as opposed to hundreds of them. But it wasn't considered. We look at it now because of what it can do in the aftermath, but at the time it wasn't necessarily considered this game changer. It was just a more efficient way of conducting war.
Well, and that's what I think is so interesting about Oppenheimer, the man, and because Truman is right. Like, they aren't going to think about him when their city is getting bombed, but Truman couldn't do it without Oppenheimer creating that. And because Truman, and I'm using him to represent everyone in the armed forces that made that decision, Groves, whoever, because they didn't have the understanding, because to them it was just another bomb. That's why I think the responsibility does fall on people like Oppenheimer who have the ability and the understanding to do that, and to know that you can't put the snake back in the bottle. And again, I'm not saying he should not have created the bomb. I'm not saying that at all, because I agree with you about the Nazis. They would have done it. But just this idea that we could use a weapon of mass destruction to achieve peace, I think is just such a fallacy, and I think that's what a lot of the movie shows, is that is the lie that you tell yourself to keep going. And like you said, you excuse it and you put it on the army generals, but that they don't really understand, and that nobody does.
And I also think that I think Nolan does a good job of depicting how, like, to a degree, Oppenheimer saw this as his legacy. He saw this as his theory of relativity moment. And the thing about Oppenheimer as a physicist, he didn't necessarily come up with new ideas of his own. Like, he didn't come up with these new, we talk about, the relationship with him and Einstein is fascinating, but it wasn't that Oppenheimer came up with these new ideas. What he was really good at is taking these really complicated, he didn't like that idea that he wasn't great at math either. Like he didn't have the patience for these calculations, but he would take all of these very complicated ideas and be able to distill them very quickly and then see practical applications for them. And that was his genius, where he saw this as his legacy. And he was a very powerful voice in the room amongst the scientists. And if he were to say, we should not drop this bomb, or we should use it in a demonstration rather than, because the problem isn't that we drop the atomic bomb. The problem is we drop the atomic bomb in civilians. The problem is we, at the push of with one bomb, killed 200,000 Japanese men, women, and children that had nothing to do with the war, that weren't our enemy, that weren't trying to kill us. And that is the problem, that if we were to drop it, then we should have dropped it in a place where it could not have harmed a person. Like, you could have dropped it on an island or somewhere and done a demonstration. But he was so consumed with this idea of this being his legacy, this being what he was going to be known for, that he pushed all other considerations aside. And then once the gravity of what he actually did hit him, then he later on became this proponent for sharing this information with other nations, not having nuclear secrets or atomic secrets, but in his idea was let's create what the United Nations should have been, but let's create an intergovernmental agency that governs how atomic energy is going to be used. And he was very against, I think you have Safdie, who plays Edward Teller here, And Teller is the inspiration for Dr. Strangelove. That's why I found when he put on the sunglasses, I immediately thought of like Kubrick and Strangelove. And if you watch The Day After Trinity, which is a documentary that came out, I think, in 1981, and it talks with a lot of Oppenheimer's colleagues, and it talks with Frank Oppenheimer. When they talk about dropping the bomb, they can't look in the camera. Like, none of them can look in the camera.
Really?
They're just, and you see them like kind of like wiping their brow, like they're really wrestling with like, what did we do here? But you can't, like you said, put that genie back in the bottom. His weakness, his real weakness was not because he was considered such a genius by so many. He thought he would always have a place at the table. And I think one of the core themes of Oppenheimer is you're useful until you're not. And the turning point of this movie, like when after the bomb, after the Trinity test, he thinks he's still going to be, if not pulling the lever of power, he's going to have a hand on that lever of power. And he doesn't even get a call. He hears about the bomb working when everybody else does. And I think it hits him, and he's been told this like, you're going to, at some point, they're going to have no use for you anymore.
Yeah, the scene where he's watching it go away on the wagons or the carts is very, and I think about the scene of it at the top of the Trinity Tower, and he's just kind of almost putting his forehead to it. And it's like birthing something, and then you just lose control of it. And I think, the line from Hamilton, like, you have no control who tells your story. It's like things come out of your hands. And with Barbie, we were talking about a lot of men don't want to let go of power, but I think a lot of men don't understand. They can't see that they ever won't have power, and they just can't understand it. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to see him kind of reckon with that and being powerless, and seeing his wife like telling him to fight. And I really love the idea that he is kind of like trying to punish himself with this trial. I don't know how accurate that is or how he was actually feeling about it, but I like that, the idea of that,
It's very, it's up to and including her, Kitty Oppenheimer's kind of combating her repartee with the district attorney. It's pretty much, I think everything from there is taken straight from the transcripts. And there's also there's a PBS like docudrama, The Trials of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Peter Strahane plays Oppenheimer. And he's played Oppenheimer twice apparently, and they throw him in this movie as well, so we can say he's been in 3 things with. But a lot of it is taken, like the transcripts are public, like you can actually read them and go through all of them, and they're kind of like, it's a fascinating read. Yeah, I like that, this idea that it's his hair shirt, that he's punishing himself. And again, you see that moment when he's getting cross-examined and asking, like, when did your morals actually come up? And you can see that's a question that he was wrestling with. Like, where did he start to develop scruples? And I don't think it had anything to do with whether or not, like, the Russians had it or the Japanese, or whether or not they were just, he's like, no, like, once you see the weapon use and once you understand the power of what you built, and then he did fight. And really what was the nail in his coffin was like fighting so hard to not make the hydrogen bomb, which Teller pushed for, because he's like, what's the point? Like, we have enough of these atomic bombs to blow our, like, at what point is like, is it too much? Is it too big? Like, how many people do you need to kill? There's like a news clip you can find of him where he's asked, like, do we have the ability to kill like 40 million people in a couple of minutes? He's like, I hate to say it, but yes, we do. Like, we could kill half the country in just a couple of minutes with our capabilities now. And that's when he's discarded. Like, once he puts his foot down and says, I'm not going to sign off on building the super bomb. I'm not going to go back to Los Alamos to help develop it. I'm going to resign my post. and I'm also going to actively go on the campaign trail against building this bomb. That's when he's discarded by those in power. They don't have a use for him anymore. Like, well, if you're not going to help us build this, then we don't need you. And then given the climate of anti-communism and the Red Scare at the time, that like his past associations were going to come back like they did so many, come back, and he thought he was shielded by his prestige and by, because it's not untrue. He was the most famous person in the world and he was considered a national hero, and he thought that was going to shield him, and eventually it only could for so long, and he just did not recognize that. And I think that's what's really fascinating here.
It's like you're in the gears for so long and then you get ground up in them, you know?
And
it's because the gears don't care about you. The machine cares about being the biggest. It doesn't care about the individual cogs. You know?
Did your theater get an uncomfortable laugh when, I think it's Chris Columbus, he is picking the sites where the bomb will be dropped, and he's like, oh yeah, we're not going to drop it here. My wife and I happened to honeymoon there. We got
I did not get a laugh there.
The most uncomfortable laughter.
Oh wow! That line chilled me. That was one of the most chilling lines I think in the movie for me. We didn't get a laugh, so an uncomfortable laugh.
Yeah.
That does strike me as the kind of thing that you would laugh at, Mike, because I know you like to laugh. It
wasn't just
when
me.
there's
Well,
tension.
I am the person that like I will buy this on Blu-ray the minute it comes out, and we watch a movie every New Year's Eve. We order Thai food or whatever. I need to know when to cue the movie up so that at midnight you have the Trinity explosion. That's how we're gonna.
Oh my god!
Yeah,
and that
which is
sequence
grim.
is so good. Yes, but it's just incredible. And that's one of the reasons I love Christopher Nolan movies. Yeah. And one of the reasons I wanted to see this in theaters, you know, is because I wanted to experience it. And it did not disappoint.
No, it did not. It's such, and I think one of the things this movie does is that at the beginning, if there are parts of the movie, it kind of shows how these scientific experiments work without getting too jargony. Like you get the visualization on screen of like the fission and these procedures occurring, and I think it helps as an audience member later on. We're used to seeing like a bomb goes off in a movie and the audio immediately accompanies it, but that's not how this works. You know, the reality is like this bomb would go off and sound would be like a good 20-30 seconds behind it. You get that here, and that's when you get the real impact of it, and it's chilling when you watch it. It's one of the things when it kind of hits like we've created this thing that can kill us many times over, and it's going to be celebrated. It's like this great achievement. I'm reading a book on Dwight Eisenhower right now, and very early in his presidency, he gave a speech. This is a military man. He was like, won the presidency based on how he conducted himself in war. And he said, for every bomb we create, this is like 50,000 barrels of wheat that we can't create. For every new plane bomber we make, these are like 10 schools that we'll never get to make. He's like, we need to not focus so much on building these weapons of mass destruction, because it's not just about what we're building, it's what we're also not building. We're not and we're not creating opportunity for others. And this was someone who was a military person that recognized like we can't sustain this. Like when you look at what, and our military budget has only gotten more unwieldy over time, and we always have money for bombs, we always have money for tanks, but we never seem to have money. School lunches is what gets cut. Like that's considered extravagant. Sending children to school, but saying we don't need to feed you.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, patriarchy is a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
That is the foundation of it, and that there is not enough to go around, and that we have to take and take and take, and it doesn't have to be that way, you know. And it takes a big paradigm shift to see a world where we make barrels of wheat instead of bombs, or we focus our scientific energy on climate change instead of ammunition, you know, but
we're capable of making great things and we focus on the terrible.
Exactly. What do we just unfreeze a worm? Like, I'm sure, hey, and you know what? I don't know. I love Ex Machina, and one of the points of that is like discovery is discovery, and part of it is that you find it in the dark and it leads you where it's supposed to go. But also, like, what are we spending our resources and our energy on? You know, because as much as I just said, there is enough to go around. There's only enough to go around if we choose to use it. You know,
I found too with this movie, with Oppenheimer, the scenes with him and Einstein were fascinating because Einstein says, "Look, you at one point gave me this award," and it's true. Like, they had a 70th birthday party for Einstein, and they wrote a series of articles to quote unquote celebrate him, but they really were celebrating themselves and how they've moved on from him. And he's like, eventually this is going to happen to you. Like, science will move on from you as well, and you'll be left in the dark. And I think one of the things you see here is like him kind of grappling with, like, once he's created this bomb, and really he doesn't create it so much as he's the administrator. He doesn't actually figure out or unlock the science behind making it. He's able to cajole and whip into shape and administer everybody else. Like, physics had left him behind by the time he creates this thing. And now what do you do? Like, this is the thing you've spent your whole life on. Now what do you do after this? And like, now he's the person that's being left behind, and now it's like Teller and these other physicists that are making these new discoveries, and he's become the Einstein. He's become that person, like, you are our past, we are looking towards the future.
Yeah. And that's why I think, and again, I don't think I know enough about Oppenheimer himself to make this a comment about him specifically, but I think the invention is just as important as teaching the next generation to think the way you think you believe. You know, like the theory behind the invention and the ethics that go with it are just as important to pass along as the formula. You know,
it is a morality tale. It's very much that.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about women that much. We talk about this.
Well, you know,
and that is my, you know, if there is a flaw in this movie, for all of his strengths as a writer and director, it feels like Nolan still struggles 20 years in to write women. And one thing, like, I'm not a prude. Like, people who know me, like, and Jen, I know you're not a prude either.
No.
Like, you know, if you could have swapped out Josh Hartnett and naked Cillian Murphy, you would. It's...
Put those.
I don't think a woman speaks for the first 30 minutes of this movie. Like, it literally, like, 20 minutes in, I'm like, I don't think a woman has talked yet. And then you introduce Florence Pugh as Jean. I can't remember her name now.
Jean Triple.
It's Jean in Tockner. I'm going to mispronounce it.
Yeah, it's something with a T.
She's a commie, but she's a filthy red.
Commie.
You introduce her briefly, and then next thing she's naked, like immediately, and that's a choice. That's a very deliberate choice.
Definitely.
She has maybe 4 scenes in the whole movie, and she's naked for 2 of them. And I get that this is a very masculine movie, and it's about Oppenheimer, and it's about creating this thing, but I think that it struggles to contend. And maybe maybe in some ways it's brilliant, because it's in a way that saying that he didn't have time for these he has a whole affair that you never see. He has a whole.
Really?
He has it with. It's the Josh Hartnett character. The reason he was going to testify against him. When
they mention it,
but it's a casual kind of blink if you miss it mention. It's a huge deal. He just like saw women as disposable. Saw women as. You know, like, I don't have time to consider your feelings because I have these great things to accomplish. But why does Nolan struggle so much to write strong women in his movies?
I don't know. I think a lot of his movies are focused on masculinity. And part of me likes removing women from that equation. Like, I like that we are kind of letting the men kind of thrash it out amongst themselves or beat each other off, if you will. But I also, I don't know, I have a lot of mixed feelings about the women in this movie, the two of them. Essentially. Well, three, because there is a female scientist at Los Alamos, which I did appreciate. And the one thing that I will give him credit for is I like that these two women both buck traditional femininity. You know, like his girlfriend does not want flowers. She doesn't feel comfortable with this relationship. She wants something non-conform. She's allowed to have complex thoughts about their romance. She doesn't just want a ring, you know? And then his wife struggles with motherhood. And I appreciate seeing that. I appreciate seeing women of this time period struggling with the really rigid ideas of what femininity is. But I also like, and there's part of me that's like, yeah, Florence Pugh wants to show her boobs, let her. That's great. Go for it. I don't think there's really anything wrong with it. It's just when you put all of these puzzle pieces together and you see this movie that is about so many men and then you just throw some boobs in my face. I'm like, what? Yeah. Why are we filming it this way,
I think the cut to it is so jarring that you've just introduced her. You've gone like really almost the whole first act without having any women speak. And then like right after you introduce someone, you see Oppenheimer like dismiss his brother's fiance, which was a real thing. Like she hated him. She was like, yeah, he was such a dick to me his whole life. That's lifted right from it. It's very accurate.
Really?
I think that at times it goes too far in having Emily Blunt as Kitty. It kind of makes her the villain in some ways. Like you're right. It does show her struggling with motherhood, but it shows him being almost like gentle and paternal. Whereas like it's not quite that simple and it's not quite that easy. And I think they had a very loving, good relationship. It was a very complicated relationship, but I think like you see the shorthand for alcoholism here where like her purse spills open and a flask falls out and everybody eyes at her disapprovingly. It takes too many shortcuts with that, I think, sometimes.
I agree. With both of the female characters, I think, in a way that the men don't have those shortcuts. You know? I mean, there is another form of shortcut, which is something that I kind of want to talk about. But the scene that I think that bothered me the most was the scene in the courtroom where they're talking about the affair. And then all of a sudden you see Florence Pugh on top of him and she is the only one naked. And I was like, what are we doing? One, we're pitting these two women against each other, of course, because they're the only two women in the film. So of course they're going to, but I also kind of like that that Strauss is just as petty, you know? So I don't know. It's not my favorite portrayal of women in any movie. I don't think it's the worst, but yeah, it's just.
I think that Pugh and Blunt make the most of, because they are two of our finer performers right now.
Yes, they
and
are.
They make the most of like some badly underwritten roles. That they do everything they possibly could do. Because we mentioned this before, like it's a who's who of, you get people that kind of like, you get Jack Quaid show up just to play the bongos a little bit. You get Benny Safdie as Teller. You get Josh, and I texted you like, you got to prepare yourself.
You did.
Josh Hartnett's looking good, and like he figured out the whole hair thing.
I told you he is hot.
He got buff. He got like somehow ripped.
Got some highlights.
You have like Matt Damon feels a little bit, his role feels a little bit too like, it's almost too jolly. Like, let's get the gang together. But he's also really good. But there's so many like people that just show up for like a scene or two and they're brilliant. And then they kind of move on from there. It's fascinating to watch that. And I think the other thing is like the pacing of this movie, the editing, like you mentioned that there's a circle all the way back. It's jarring it feels very hard to keep up with at times. Like it asks a lot of you. And, you know, I want my daughter to see this. She's like, it's just 3 hours of like men in a room talking. And I'm like, you're right, it is, but it's so fucking good. Like it's sometimes those are the best movies. What was the second thing you wanted to bring up? You mentioned a flaw or something that kind of didn't sit well.
Oh, no, it wasn't necessarily a flaw, but I was thinking about just the clothing, you know, and when you were mentioning, because I was thinking, well, we've got Florence Pugh as like slutty girlfriend Barbie, and then we have Emily Blunt as like drunky housewife Barbie. So they're very like caricatures of these kind of women archetypes, you know, and they are more complicated than like college girlfriend versus like homemaker, you know, so it is more complicated, but they still don't feel totally human. But the other thing that I think is so fascinating, I came out of it and I can't remember if I tweeted or I texted or whatever, but I was like, it was a lot of hot men in suits, because it was this, I wanted to talk about the clothing in Oppenheimer, because I think that's a really interesting comparison to Barbie, where like Barbie is defined by her outfit, you know, and that's part of the fun of getting a new Barbie is what's she going to wear and what's the astronaut costume going to look like. And I think in Oppenheimer, like you see the man, the two kinds of man outfits is the white button down shirt, the tie. Sometimes it's a vest, sometimes it's a suspender, but it's always a suit unless it's a military uniform. And I think my point in bringing that up is that those are the only two options. You know, that's what you do. And the one who wears a sweater, the guy who was the podcaster in Halloween, he's the outcast because he's the communist, you know, and it's so interesting to think about like that. Those are the two costumes for men. And you're either like a military man or you are a man of knowledge.
Right. And when Oppenheimer puts on a military outfit, his friend Robbie tells him like, get that off. Like you're not, you be yourself.
Like, that's not you.
No, that's not who you are. I've been watching a lot of older movies this past year, like a lot of film noir, a lot of Hitchcock. And that's what men wore. Everybody wore suits. Yeah. And I kind of want to bring that back. Like, I don't know. Like, and I'm someone who I just live in cargo shorts. And I will say, like, nice clothes burn my skin because they do. But I wish I could pull off, like, a good suit because I would wear it. I definitely would dress like that.
Well, and I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wearing suits, and men who wear suits, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And if you can pull off a good hot suit, like Josh Hartnett in a suit, yes, please. But I think the problem comes when those are the only two acceptable options. You know, I listened to a podcast where the host is male identifying and just constantly wearing skirts because he's like, they're just more comfortable. Or I think about like Timothée Chalamet showing up to premieres in like that red kind of pantsuit thing, you know, like women, that's one of the benefits I think of women or patriarchy is I can't
better clothes
that, but like better clothes or just more freedom, like more options. And I think men have more options now, but back then, like
I think the flip side of that though is when a man puts in a little bit of effort, it gets over the top praise. Do you know what I mean? Like
exactly. Well, it's like what we also always used to talk about with fatherhood. You know,
like just pushing my kid around in the park. Like, oh, you're doing. I'm like, I'm
you're
just
such a great dad.
What any dad should be doing. Like, the bar is pretty low. Jean Tatlock, that is who Florence Pugh was playing. So I wanted to say one thing I wanted to point out, like with part of the reason why it feels like those characters are given the short shrift is like Tatlock was a brilliant psychiatrist on her own. Like she's a doctoral level psychiatrist that worked at one of the first integrated hospitals in San Francisco. Like she was a woman of great principle, and she did a lot of work in child psychology, with child psychiatry. So she was a brilliant woman on her own. And Kitty Oppenheimer was a doctoral level botanist. Like she was a brilliant woman on her own. Her job, and she has said, like her job came to be being Oppenheimer's cheerleader in some ways and kind of pushing him towards greatness, where you can maybe attribute some of her struggles with being this brilliant, brilliant person, and the only outlet you have for it is like your home garden. So,
Yeah.
and that is where, use the patriarchy again, where the patriarchy really hurts persons. So
Yeah.
I could go on on this movie. Like I honestly could do like 10 parts on it we're going like really just off the cuff right now. And I'm going to put in my notes here for the show. Cause it's again, like we both said, like it's the kind of movie that makes me want to dive into everybody's history.
Yeah.
I did an audiobook. It's called Hiroshima. It's about Paul Hersey. He was a reporter for the New Yorker. That one thing I didn't know, like I just assumed that like once the bombs went off, everybody understood how awful they were. And what I didn't realize was the army covered up their effects for a year. Ooh. They were like, oh yeah, there's no such thing as radiation poisoning. And like things are getting back to normal in here. And that's what the American public thought. And Hersey got permission from the army to go into Hiroshima for 2 weeks. And he told the survivors' stories. He was able to kind of put a human face to the tragedy of Hiroshima. And it changed the way the American public viewed the bomb, and also changed the way the American public viewed the government. It was one of the first real cases of Americans going, oh, wait a minute, if you've been able to hide this from us from a year, this idea that like how destructive this thing actually is and the real cost of it, what else are you hiding from it? It's a book called Hiroshima. It's all about his article. I can link to his article. And then there was also a rebuttal from Stimson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, who had retired since then. He had a role in choosing the targets. And he talked about why we dropped the bomb, but he never refuted the effects of it. And it was when he wrote that article thinking this will diffuse it, the public was like, yeah, but you still shouldn't have dropped this fucking thing. Like, why do you think these two movies together, like why is Barbenheimer a thing? Why is it striking such a chord with audiences right now?
Well, I think partly because I think we're all growing. Like there's a lot of like gender coding with these movies. Like it would be really easy to say this is a movie for girls, this is a movie for boys. And I love that everybody seems to want to see both, not everybody, but a lot of people. And I think we're kind of just starved for original movies now. And I mean, we're coming from the horror world, so we know that original movies come out all the time, like Cobweb, which was completely buried under these two movies for, oh my God, I have no clue who just made that decision. Anyways, but like
it deserved better. Justice for Cobweb.
It was good.
Cobweb.
I really liked it. Yeah, Cobwebheimer. Yeah, but I think we're just like these were two completely original movies, and I think they go together very well. And
strangely well.
Yeah, and I think it's something that has been kind of not necessarily brewing under the surface for a while, but there's a lot of relevance to what's going on right now. There's a lot of, but not like on the nose, it's not like Bombshell, a movie like about things that happened 3 years ago, and I think it just happened to just hit at the right, there's a right place, right time element to it too. There's a merchandising element, like the symmetry of the titles, like it makes a great couple name. There's just like, there's kind of a lightning in a bottle feeling that I think is part of it too.
I think that Barbie lifted Oppenheimer more than vice versa.
I agree.
I would say that would be the case. I think why it resonates to a certain extent is, for whatever reason, audiences didn't put these movies against one another. It wasn't a case of like one has to fail so the other can succeed, that they both kind of leaned into it. And Nolan has said that like, oh, I didn't even know Barbie was coming out the same day, because Barbie coming out the same day as Oppenheimer. Like, and that's the weekend, the second to last weekend of July has traditionally been when Nolan has released his last few movies. It was a shot across the bow from Warner Brothers, who he left after he had a pretty acrimonious split with them because of HBO releasing all these movies on HBO the same day as theatrical. He was really against that and left. So this was a real shot across the bow at him, but rather than embrace that conflict or that kind of confrontation, audiences are like, well, why not both? Like, what if we lift each other up? And I don't think you can do that with like a lot of movies. I don't think you can do that everywhere. And it's super encouraging to me. Like, again, I've seen this twice. I saw it in Canada, and it is interesting watching it with a non-American audience as well. But seeing teenagers and younger people that aren't necessarily your market for a 3-hour movie about a historical drama, like that's not, but leaning into it and really enjoying it and taking something away. I think it should be shown in schools. I think it's an important movie. But ultimately, what movie of the two do you think is, and I almost hate saying this, but like ultimately, what movie is more important?
Barbie. I think Barbie. And I think the reason I say that is not because I think Barbie is a better movie, because I don't know. It's hard for me to really separate them, honestly. I think of them as connected, but I think that there are movies that tell similar stories as Oppenheimer. Maybe not as well, but there's not a whole lot out there like Barbie. And I think Barbie is something that we need to hear more of, and I want more of. If there was one that I wanted to succeed more, it was Barbie, because that becomes proof that a female director can open a big movie, you know, or that a female-led comedy can make money. And I think, so yeah, that I think Barbie. And I think if I think about which one is going to leave a bigger impact, I think it's Barbie also. And again, that's not a knock against Oppenheimer.
No, not at all.
I think it is fantastic.
Not pitting.
But
I don't mean to pit one against the other. I agree for all the reasons you said. I think it's the largest. It's had the largest opening of any movie directed by a woman ever. The largest second weekend. If its second weekend was its first weekend, we'd still call it a massive success. It is the announcement of like Greta Gerwig onto the big stage in like the biggest, splashiest way possible, you know, and she is someone who, like Scorsese pointed her out when he said, like, look, we need to have, like, I'm 80 years old, like superhero movies aren't for me. We need spaces in theaters for directors like Greta Gerwig, like he name checked her, that it is going to hopefully open. I'm very fascinated to see what studios get wrong, what lessons they take away that they just completely get wrong. But at the same time, hopefully it will open more doors for creatives and for more women creating movies. And, you know, I want to see what, I think the next thing Gerwig's she's doing is like the Chronicles of Narnia movies for Netflix. Really? But I wonder what her next thing will be. Like, she's brilliant. She's 3 for 3. And have you seen House of the Devil, the Ty West movie?
I have. Oh, that's
she
right.
Has
She's the roommate, right?
Greatest death, like out of nowhere death. Like, so it's amazing. Like the woman who gets like shot in the face in a really explicit way has created this massive movie. Last thing I have is like the last line from each movie. I think they both end on brilliant. And I did see some pushback on the Barbie one. Like, I'm here to see my gynecologist. That someone wrote, like, well, you're saying that women are defined by having a vagina and not all women do it. I'm like, you're overthinking it. It's like, no.
Oh, yeah.
Because, like, Barbie is plastic bits. Like, that's a joke in the movie. And it's brilliant to sneak that into a kid's movie.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, like, if I were to think about it, because I had not thought about the last two lines together until I saw them in your notes. I was like, yeah, man, it's really hard to have a vagina in this country right now. Yeah. You know? Yeah.
And that last line of Oppenheimer when he says to Einstein, talking about like whether or not they've set off a chain reaction that'll destroy the world. And he says, I believe we did. And it goes full circle back to showing what's in his brain at the start of the movie. But now you're showing the future and these nuclear missiles being launched. And the fiery explosion we see at the end of the movie, and the world basically in flames, and it ends on that with the music rides. It is more chilling than any horror movie, and there's been some good ones this year.
Yeah, there have been.
But it's so important, especially where we live now. We live in a world where, like, you know, if this movie had come out 5 years ago, I think that it would have been a little bit more quaint. It would have been like, do you remember when, like, we were going to, there's a really real possibility we're going to blow ourselves up. And that fear has returned. I hate to say it, but that fear has returned. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, to compare those two lines, like, and to get on my, like, I don't know, really hopeful soapbox, is that a thing? Like, I think we can destroy the world as we know it, and maybe what will come out of it is a better world. And maybe I think that's what I see with the ending of Barbie, is that yes, she is going to the gynecologist, which is great, because now, like, she has seen a plastic world, and now she is going to see what it's really like to be a woman. And that's ultimately how things change, is to really get out there. Like, you can't change things from the mountaintop. And I think that can be the spark, understanding how other people actually live, that can destroy the patriarchy, maybe, I guess, to put a bow on it. But
all right,
I wish her well at the gynecologist. Yeah.
And Oppenheimer's dead, so not much he can do.
And Oppenheimer's dead, so you know.
There'd be the idea for the sequel to Oppenheimer. At the end of his life, he and his wife, like, traveled to, like, the islands a lot, and they had a little summer place down there.
Oh yeah, I heard that.
And they would get into, like, awful disputes with their neighbors and throw these wild parties. Like, the neighbor showed up with a gun and just started shooting it off at them because he was so frustrated.
Wow.
So there's a great, like, Will Ferrell comment. Will Ferrell is older Oppenheimer and just being a complete fucking maniac on the islands.
Oh, I want to see petty bitch Oppenheimer.
I would absolutely
petty
watch that movie.
Oppenheimer.
So,
that would be great.
So, all right, Jen, what's going on with the Losers Club, and what else do you have coming up right now? If we don't blow ourselves up by the time this episode comes out.
Well, lots of things coming up, lots of exciting things. I finished Holly a couple of weeks ago, so we're going to have our episode on that coming up soon, which is the new Stephen King book.
Oh, okay. On Holly Gibney?
Yeah. It was good. I liked it. And then if you like me talking about bad boys or just boys in general, we're about to count down Stephen King's 10 baddest boys, which I'm very excited about. And then the next book episode, I believe, is just after, Full Dark, No Stars. So very excited about that. And then Rachel and I just started season 2 of The Boys. But before that, we talked about Superman.
Excellent.
Which apparently fucking Marlon Brando is in that movie. I had completely forgotten about that. And just writing. If you like me talking about feminism, check out my column at Dread Central, because there's a lot of feminism and lady stuff there.
Hey, what's the name of that column?
Yeah. Well, now it's called Fatal Femmes. It was Matriarchy Rising, and I shifted to talking about girls getting along to girls killing other girls.
Oh, okay.
Girls
Excellent.
killing people. So I just wrote about The Conjuring, Bathsheba and The Conjuring. And I don't think it's out yet, but probably by the time this one drops. But you can find all of that stuff at Jennferatu, and I'll just post it all.
Excellent.
So.
All right, listeners. If you've liked what you've heard today, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, basically every podcatcher service that there is. Taking a minute to give us a rating and writing us a review, giving us a 5-star rating and writing a quick review, it definitely helps new listeners find us. It lets us know we're on the right track, and we really appreciate it. So if you haven't done so, please take a minute and do so. That would be fantastic. Follow us at our website, www.thepodandthependulum.com. That's where we have all of our back episodes listed with all of our show notes, transcripts for some of our newer episodes and such as well. It's a really well laid out site. It's very easy to find any of the franchises we've done as we near 200 episodes here. If you really like what you've heard and want to support the show, go to patreon.com/podandthependulum. For as low as a couple bucks a month, you get bonus content such as full-length episodes. You get our rental shelf where we talk about whatever we are watching and listening to at the time. So go ahead and become a patron today at patreon.com/thepodandthependulum. Here's what we have coming up in the very near future. We are going to be doing the Saw franchise, but we have one episode in between that where I'll be breaking down my coverage of the Fantasia Film Fest, talking about a lot of the great titles that I had a chance to see out there. That episode will be out next week, and then it is 10 weeks of Saw. So I think we're getting pretty excited for that. Thank you again. We hope you enjoyed this little detour. Try to do something a little different this week. We hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with our coverage of Fantasia. Take care.